This is Mara and Ben for Stellar Strategy Gaming. Today we're going to talk about how to run a campaign at level 20.
Yes, now there is actually surprisingly a little bit of confusion about what a level 20 campaign is, and the way how we're wording it can be a bit ambiguous. We don't mean you're reaching level 20, no, we mean you start off at level 20 with all of your abilities unlocked and all of your weird multi-classing already done and all of your feats and all that. So you already have your whole ability and you have a very powerful character. This isn't we're going to grind for the 30 sessions it requires to eventually be able to kill God kind of thing.
And it's important to understand that there's a very big difference between reaching level 20 and starting at level 20. I ran a level 10 campaign not very long ago, and one of the characters decided to do 5 levels of Rogue and 5 levels of Ranger. This was a person with extensive play experience, had definitely reached level 10 before, but he had never sort of jumped in at level 10. And what I came to realize from this experience is that levels roughly 1 to 3, you're pretty much trying not to die. 3 to 5 is when you're sort of getting into the meat of how your character works, how all their mechanics work if you haven't played that combination of race and class before. And then 5 to 10 is when you tend to actually really take off because you have a deeper understanding of the character. So with level 20, make sure your players are really up for it. And I don't just mean that they're experienced players. Sometimes this can actually be harder for someone who's played through, for example, multiple editions. I've played with people who have been playing since 3rd or 4th E, or who've played Pathfinder, and that can actually make it worse because they get confused about the rules. So just make sure your players are sort of up for this and are sort of have all the tools they need to make it happen, and make sure you as the DM are up for it, because that is a lot of abilities and powers to work around.
Yes. Now, something that a lot of people tend to do in level 20 campaigns is they use a lot of traps because they think, oh, well, I don't want my players to instantly be able to kill Loth or whatever it is. And so you have traps that send you back to the start of a dungeon, or traps which deal unreasonable amounts of damage, or things like that. In fact, a very good example of this would be the very popular, for some reason, Tomb of Horrors or Tomb of Annihilation. They're basically the same thing, where I believe it was the brainchild of Gary Gygax way back when, and it's been ported over to 5e, not particularly well. And some of the traps in that, and for the record, before I get into this, Gary Gygax said that this was a dungeon for invincible characters. And some of the traps in there have descriptions like, this trap sends your character back to the start of the dungeon with no equipment, and their gender is reversed, and their alignment is reversed, and things like that. Or there's a trap which, if you walk into it and you spend 10 minutes there, you die. That is, no checks, no nothing, you just die. And let me tell you, there is no better way to alienate their players than saying, hey, develop this level 20 character, really get to know their abilities and figure out how they work and understand it, and then I'm just going to kill them off in -1 session, basically.
Yes, and if you if you want to run that kind of grinding, rough playstyle, that's fine, but if you're trying to develop an interesting storyline around these powerful characters, then that's not the way to go. Every trap, every encounter, everything you deal with should in some way advance the story and should in some way develop the characters. If you enjoy doing traps, there's an old movie called The Cube where a group of people have to escape from a labyrinth, essentially. Each character has some kind of talent that helps them do that, and they discover their talents as they go. Another, perhaps more well-known example would be in the movie The Princess Bride. We see our hero, who at the beginning we know only as the Dread Pirate Roberts. First he has to duel with a sword master, then he has to fight with brute strength against a giant, and then he has to outsmart a master tactician. But each of those encounters tells us something about the hero, fills out the world a little bit, fills out the villains we're dealing with, and then it sets it up for the end of the movie when he actually winds up, they recruit him to help with the resolution of everything, So we see everything play out together. Now, we could have had the same amount of screen time with the character just encountering, for example, a party of goblins, but that wouldn't have advanced the story any. He wouldn't have done anything. And the same thing applies for traps. What is this doing in terms of character development and describing the world your story is happening in?
Oh, yes, and in fact, another great kind of puzzle I love, especially if you're going to do that sort of grinding campaign, but you also want to have it be a little bit more intelligence-based, is, I forget exactly where it's from, but there is basically at the heart of a giant cube in space is this ancient treasure, whatever, and the basic concept behind it is as you move through each of the rooms, the further away you get from the treasure, the less dangerous the rooms become, so it actively encourages you to move away from the rooms subconsciously, whereas the more difficult the challenges are, the closer you are to whatever treasure it is. And so you could throw your players into that, and they'll probably try to take the easy way and not get anywhere and probably sort of wear themselves out a little bit, but they'll still be gaining experience, though it doesn't really matter. At level 20, they'll still be getting loot, probably. And on top of that, once they figure it out, it'll be a great moment at the table. They'll all go, oh!
Yes, and it's also a good way to have your characters, as I said before, it gets the chance to get familiar with how their abilities actually work at level 20. If somebody hasn't played that kind of character at level 20, or seen how those abilities interact with each other, because sometimes your characters can play off of each other, then that's a good moment to do it.
Yes. Now, something else is just that you're going to be coming up against godlike beings here, and I know that this is a bit of a trope around level 20 campaigns, but it is a true one, basically, is that at this level, especially if you have magic users in your party, you are literally bending reality to your will, which at the very least attracts some very powerful beings. If you're lawful evil, for example, or chaotic evil, whichever one, you might have some celestials or divas coming after you at some point, whereas if you're lawful good, well, the demon lords might not like that you're trying to end the blood war too early. So there's quite a bit that you can do with that. For example, you could have it be that Zariel herself asks you to go grab her sword from the aforementioned cube dungeon thing I suggested. Or you could have it be that, finally, at long last, the devils and angels have agreed to work together to fight off a Sararak because his plans are coming to fruition, or whatever it is. But it does highlight, like, that is the kind of enemy you will be fighting, is a Sararak, the being more powerful than almost every planar being.
And don't be afraid to get weird and get interesting and get different with this kind of campaign. You could be a party of deep gnomes trying to fight your way through the drow city of Menzoberranzan to save your settlement. You could be, I kind of like the idea of doing a variation on We Be Goblins, but you're all level 20 and your goal is to kill the goblin god who has been, the goblin afterlife is just miserably fighting in his war against Grumsh and whoever else. And now your characters are going to replace the Pantheon. Like, you can really go nuts. You can really do some interesting stuff when you have characters this powerful and at this high of a level.
Yes, and my sort of final thought is that the replacing the Pantheon suggestion is actually already a bit of a staple in fantasy and sci-fi. You can call it the endless space trope, you can call it the XCOM trope, whatever you want to call it. Basically, I'll use XCOM because it's probably the most widely known. You defeat the final baddie, only to discover you've effectively become them in doing so, and it's everywhere in popular media for very good reason, and it's a very compelling story, though it does risk, for a bad storyteller, it does risk being classic to the point of being boring. But that is also definitely a very good way to end a level 20 campaign, because it also sets up those characters to perhaps come back in cameos in the futures and such. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe, maybe even comment if you have ideas for the future, or you have great examples of your own level 20 campaigns. And next time we'll be doing How to DM for Noobs.